Curioso, and welcome back to Ancient Wales, Episode 3, Protection, Worship, or Winter Quarters. As we reach the Iron Age, we need to speak to some extent about the enigmatic hill forts that dot the landscape of Britain. These fortifications are more than just relics of the past. They are windows into the lives, cultures, and conflicts of the ancient communities. What they are and what they were used for, and what they did, has been something of a question for scholars, archaeologists, and historians for time long past. Hill forts themselves, however, emerged during the Late Bronze Age, becoming prominent in the Iron Age between 800 BCE and 43 CE, around the time of the Roman conquest. These fortified sites often were perched on elevated terrain. Sometimes this was a natural elevation, be it through mountain or through hill, or possibly reuse of Bronze Age burial mounds. However, they also could reflect a site that was built up by the local community and created from scratch, especially in areas where there isn't a natural site for them. They came about because, of course, we think due to social change, technological advancements as iron enters into this period, and increasing competition for resources as populations grew. As historian Toby Driver put it in describing hill forts, quote, "It is generally understood that developments of strongly defended settlements and hill forts began in the latter Bronze Age, but achieved their maximum number during the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. So," end quote. So hill forts began, as I said, in the Bronze Age, which was an era that was perceived as being peaceful, though recent archaeological discoveries may show that this perception may not actually be as accurate as we once thought. There have been instances, such as recently as the last few months, where there was evidence of one group attacking another and cannibalizing themselves on the victims. We don't know enough about it to make a lot of guesses as to what happened. We just know that the bones are broken in a way that would suggest that they were eaten, to put it bluntly. So, what makes them so popular? Why were hill forts starting to grow in use in a way that wouldn't really be seen again until the Romans came and eventually till medieval castles? Literally hundreds of them have been found across the UK, and we're not entirely sure there aren't thousands of them. Since, of course, a lot of places they may have been tilled over, they may have been reused for castles in later periods, or in some cases may have been in populous-heavy sites that at the time may have been a place where there were a few houses and protection, but now exist in cities that are so large that they just couldn't have that territory stay separate, and they were either tilled over or destroyed, or any number of things could have happened to them. Design and construction of these places became much more elaborate as we get closer to the Roman landings. As historian Driver says, the early Iron Age was followed by increasing complexity. During the 4th and 2nd centuries BCE, during this Middle Iron Age, there were changes in how society acted and what was being developed. And there was a growing complexity and ostentation of these defenses and gateways. This developing ostentation was often on a scale that exceeded basic requirements for defense, suggesting a symbolic role for some of the more imposing ramparts, perhaps to reinforce the status of the inhabitants. More recently, such symbolic displays and ostentation have been described under the term monumentality. End quote. Our understanding of the historic version of hill forts mostly comes from a time in late antiquity when Britons began to flee to these areas for protection from a maddening landscape. The other historic record comes from the invading Romans themselves. The historian and Roman senator Tacitus, in describing the Battle of Mons Graupius, said in talking about the Britons hiding in their secure forts, quote, "The Roman troops were mad for action and ready to rush into this fort, but Agricola marshaled them with care. The British army was stationed on higher ground and in a manner calculated to impress and intimidate its enemy. The other ranks rose, as it were, up in tiers up the gentle slope. The space between the two armies was taken up by charioteers. End quote. The idea of hill forts, as interpreted by the Romans, was as places that were simply meant to impress and intimidate their enemies, something that the Romans thought the Britons did with a number of different methods and ways during their battles, some of which we'll address in later episodes. Historian Barry Cunliffe describes hill forts as both defensive strongholds and symbols of power, showcasing the ability of a community to mobilize resources and manpower. Their height and complexity made them stand out in the countryside in more ways than one. Archaeologist Ruth Taylor says, quote, "They were not just some military structure, but were also centers of trade, governance, and community life, encapsulating the complexities of the Iron Age society." The prime purpose of hill forts has been a topic of debate amongst scholars, and while their defensive nature is generally acknowledged and evident, steep slopes and ditches and ramparts obviously provide protection against invasion and assault. However, many experts have argued that these structures served broader social and economic functions, as we've just mentioned in the particular experts we've quoted here. I would also argue that they work like palaces in later periods, or maybe you could use the example of the Motte and Bailey Castle of the Norman periods, which dotted the landscape and acted as both signs of occupation, but also signs of intimidation, as well as being a location for the military to gather and to go out and fight various invasions or rebellions, as the case may be. These hill forts were also areas where administration of territory was likely done. Hill forts were strategically located. They offered natural defenses, and their steep incline and layered ramparts made them difficult to breach. And also, there was complexity in that construction, which made them sincerely hard to build and maintain. Excavations at Maiden Castle in Dorset, for example, one of the largest hill forts in Britain, revealed evidence of violent conflict, including arrowheads and skeletons with traumatic injuries. Earlier historians saw hill forts as outposts built by foreign invaders, likely using the Normans as their examples, with their Motte and Bailey castles. This would probably prove false because they were so ubiquitous across Britain and Ireland. They were technological innovations rather than invasion tools, and it's not clear that all hill forts were even for a defensive purpose. Some definitely served that purpose, as time went on, saw some form of combat during the Iron Age and later Roman invasion. They were truthfully defensive points in the landscape. However, in some cases, it may have been as much about presentation as it was about demonstrating some sort of defensive structure, and modern historians and archaeologists have pushed back against the defensive narrative. These forts often functioned as centers of governance. As you can imagine, chieftains or shamans or druids, take your pick, would be able to assert their authority from these high vantage points. Also, if they were merely defensive outposts, they would not have been something you would settle in over the long haul. You wouldn't need to live in these places, which they definitely did because they built up roundhouses there, and they show occupation over long terms, with remains of granaries and workshops suggesting that they were hubs of production and storage, not just defensive locations. From the outset, hill forts were considered to be strategic machines built to repel attack, with the hill fort engineer judging his tactical aims for the hill fort against the type of attack he would encounter and whether close combat or missile warfare was to be expected. Ramparts and entrances to hill forts were responses to three methods of attack: close combat attack, missile attack, and attack by fire. This was the interpretation of an archaeologist by the name of Avery, who was looking at these sites as purely defensive sites. And to him, that is how you interpret them. And that was how you come to understand their position in the landscape and how they work. That the ramparts served two purposes: to repel attack and to be well built within the principles of soil engineering. These themes remained something that were continually used by historians and archaeologists. And right up until the last couple of decades, this was the interpretation of all hill forts. And it is something that changes over time and is something that has to almost be forced upon people to consider that there might be other reasons for these sites to be used and other ways that they might be used. Obviously, hill forts are going to have a sense of awe and wonder. They are standing in places where buildings are not being built the way we would consider them modern sites. The largest place you may have ever seen might be a hill fort. That doesn't naturally occur. Much like how, if you go back to the Bronze Age, there are barrows, which are these massive earth mounds, effectively, where burials are built into. You have this construction by humanity that stands out and stands above. And that's part of the reason why Roman military people were mentioning them as being so impressive and intimidating. It wasn't the fact that they were necessarily great at defending people, but it was the fact that they would show this sense of, here's what we did, here's this site that we've made, and look at how we've protected it, and how dare you try to come to it and try to attack it. All of those things would be in the back of the minds of the attacker. And if the sites are built properly, they would definitely work as defenses, and they would definitely work to keep people out. So yes, they did have that use, but it didn't mean that that was the only thing. And as I mentioned earlier, symbology as much as military function can combine together in these sites. The other thing is too, is if you were a chief or a king or a leader of a people, a site like this could be used as your place for control. If you wanted to issue out indulgences to the local population, say you've had a good harvest period, which is then collected into the leader can issue it out from this massive building or this massive construction to show how magnanimous they may be with other people. And obviously it would be a place where they could construct Iron Age tools and weapons and other things, so that those also could be used as bargaining chips with traders and with other local tribes and peoples, so that you can continue to maintain links. So likely what the hill forts do and how they represent is multifolded into many different categories, chief among which, of course, is defensive, but it is not the only thing. And there is speculation that these buildings or these areas may not have been permanently inhabited, that people may have only visited them at certain times of the year for protection, for upkeep. There was a common idea that people would live in the lowlands and then go to the hill fort when they needed protection. But that belies some of what we talked about, which is that these structures were maintained, that they built actual houses there, shows that was not the case, and that likely these places were used, if they were used as effectively winter quarters or as a place to run to for protection, then at some point they migrated into being the site. They became, in effect, a town or a village in their size and in their dimension to go with their protection, much like medieval cities and towns got walls built around them. Well, in these sites, they got hill forts built around them, or built that they were built on top of. So we have to understand it in that context and in that understanding. And so, yes, there is a military aspect to all of this, of course. There has to be a reason why you would go to the bother of building something this unbelievably large. But we have to understand that that doesn't mean that this architecture is for that alone, and that this idea of our ancestors being obsessed with protecting themselves at all times wouldn't also mean that they wouldn't look at, how can I make this look good? And how do I make this look like, aren't I the biggest kid on the block because I have the most impressive structure or the most impressive ditches or the best looking gate, or all of those kind of things that we think of as part of society and as part of how we live even today in the way houses are constructed and built. Think of it from that idea, and I think you understand that, yes, a house has a purpose, but a house that has 3 bathrooms and 4 bedrooms and a pool and a tennis court and what are the purposes of those? It's not strictly about protecting someone from the elements. It isn't strictly about a place for people to cook and sleep. At that point, it becomes a place of ostentation. And that's what they mean when they talk about these kind of things. So understand that when we talk about this, and you'll kind of get what I'm talking about with this whole idea. Hill forts facilitated trade as well, as their elevated positions made them visible landmarks for travelers and traders across the countryside. Artifacts such as imported pottery and tools unearthed at sites like South Cadbury Castle in Somerset indicate extensive trade networks. So the question remains, were these developments in defensive complexity linked to a more aggressive military role? Were forts specifically designed to repel attack, or were they simply defenses intended more for symbolic purposes, much like how human heads were usually found in these sites and often seen as some form of warning, possibly, or possible spiritual protection? The idea of the dead protecting the living. It seems likely that the defensive nature and the symbolism were actually, in fact, inseparable. So, with that in mind, let us turn to some examples. Spanning 47 acres, Maiden Castle in Dorset is a colossal example of hill fort engineering. Its multiple ramparts and ditches created an imposing defensive network. Finds from the site include Iron Age coins, pottery, and they painted a picture of a thriving settlement that was bustling with activity. In places like Northern Ireland, while they may not have had what we would consider in the strictest sense of the term a hill fort, they did have sites like Dun Allin, which have similarities in structure and function. And they make noteworthy counterparts to the wider Celtic hill forts. In recent excavations suggest it was a ceremonial center as well as a defensive site. Unique amongst hill forts is Eden's Hall Broch in Berwickshire, which combines the features of a broch, a dry stone tower, with those of a traditional hill fort. Its double-walled construction and intricate layout indicate advanced architectural techniques. There are a large number of hill forts in West Wales, and from the north to the south, they dot the landscape. They are generally much smaller than their counterparts in England, which might point to a couple of different conclusions. One, that because there's a smaller population there, there's less need for an expansive site. Or two, there may be different cultural ideas or cultural identities imbued in them, which have different reasons for their use. Example number one, nestled in the Llŷn Peninsula, is Tre'r Caerhun, which is one of the best preserved hill forts in Britain. Its name means town of giants, and reflecting the awe it inspires even today. Archaeological surveys have uncovered over 150 stone huts within its walls, or roundhouses, suggesting it housed a significant population. Next is Moel Arthur, built over 2,500 years ago, around 500 BCE. It is one of a series of iron hill forts to be found in the summits of the hills of the Clwydian Range in North Wales. Overlooking the valley of Clwyd, it sits between Moel Llys y Coed and another hill fort at Pen y Clwyddau. Evidence has been found showing activity on Moel Arthur as not only during the Iron Age, but also in the earlier Bronze Age. A possible Bronze Age burial mound lies at the center of the fort, and in 1962, 3 copper Bronze Age flat axes were found within the ramparts. Earlier excavations also turned up a coarse Roman pottery and flint arrows, suggesting the hill fort was in use both before and after the Iron Age. Finally, from a relatively modern dig in Dinastrinel, a coastal hill fort set on a hill of glacier drift sediments overlooking the sea and Carnarvonshire coastal plain. This hill fort is in an area near the Menai Strait, and it would have been a great place for herding animals as well as to carry out fishing and to overlook the Irish Sea in order to spot invaders or other traders or any number of different people. Excavation evidence and radiocarbon dates from the roundhouses indicate Iron Age construction with continued occupation into the Roman period. Also found there is a Roman period lighthouse and a number of Romano-British artifacts, including pottery such as black burnished ware, red Samian ware, and Roman coins, and the stray find of an intaglio, which is an incised gem usually as part of jewelry, though not exclusively so. They would also have imagery that would include symbols, animals, and at times gods. They appear to have been employed across various wealth classes. As Roman Britain fell, the Iron Age hill forts would come back into use, and it is speculated that this was the case at this site. It is thought that the hill fort takes its name from one of the legendary figures in the Mabinogion, Llw Llaw Gyffes. Din in Old Welsh means fort, and Lle is short for Llw. There is evidence for a longevity of occupation across the area. This includes things like a Neolithic remains, which have been found immediately south of the hill fort, showing that there was, as I mentioned earlier, continual use at these sites, and something that would be obvious when you have a location which is close to rivers, close to a major water source, or an area where growing and ranching can be carried out relatively easily. The archaeological remains within the hill fort include roundhouses that are particularly well preserved and survived mostly as a result of it being protected by a wind-blown meter of sand, which began to bury the site around 1100 years before today. On the north side of the roundhouse, pits are a shallow ditch which were found sealed by a layer of buried soil which contained a small iron chisel. In the ditch also was a small iron hammerhead, which may be the first tool of its kind to have been discovered in Wales. Its weight, less than 100 grams, suggested that it was used for delicate work. The pits, ditch, and hammer are likely to be contemporary with the occupation roundhouse. It appears that after a period of disuse and abandonment, the roundhouse partially collapsed and was sealed by repeated layers of wind-blown sand over an extended period of time. Next on our list is Castell Henllys Hill Fort. Henllys is located in South Wales, south of Cardigan, and sits in an area where Neolithic people settled and continued to live through the various centuries. This hill fort had been a focus of scientific excavation since 1980, which provided an unparalleled understanding of the small promontory fort occupied from the Iron Age to Roman times. One of the most unusual defensive discoveries at Castell Henllys was made by an archaeologist, Harold Mittam. Below one of the outer banks of the hill fort, he discovered a chevre de frise, what is referred to as a sort of prehistoric barbed wire. It was particularly effective at stopping cavalry and chariots, and that's why it extended in a band outside the gateway area, so attackers would become entangled at the point where they were in slingshot range. This feature is common in France and Spain, but relatively unknown in Britain, showing that there was this trade going on between various European areas. Before this particular excavation, no one even knew that these stones existed at Castell Henllys, and it makes you wonder how many others are waiting to be found at these sites. Archaeologists have unearthed significant clues about daily life within these forts. Dr. Alice Roberts notes, quote, "The remains of granaries, animal pens, and communal spaces point to a society that is both agricultural and hierarchical." In contrast, Professor John Collis argues, quote, "Hill forts should not be romanticized as solely peaceful or democratic. Their very existence highlights a society prepared for conflict and competition." End quote. The arrival of the Romans brought profound changes to Iron Age Britain. Some of the hill forts, such as some of the ones we mentioned, and as well as Hod Hill in Dorset, were overtaken and repurposed by Roman forces. Others were abandoned as their strategic importance diminished as Roman engineering and other forms of defenses and settlements began to occur. Archaeological evidence suggests as well that while some communities resisted fiercely, others adapted and integrated within the Roman culture and technology, so thus there was less need for these kind of sites or less desire to use them. And the remnants of Roman roads and villas, which are near these former hill fort sites, underscore this transition. In conclusion, the hill forts of Iron Age Britain remain powerful symbols of an era that is defined by ingenuity, resilience, and change. They provide valuable insights into the lives of our ancestors, from their daily struggles to their broader societal structures. As we continue to study these sites, we uncover not just the history of the people who built them, but also the enduring legacy of their ingenuity and adaptability. Thank you again for listening. Thank you so much for being a part of this series. And I hope this has been helpful. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com, or you can reach out to me at Blue Sky or X at Welsh History Pod, or on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History. And oh, by the way, if you'd like to help contribute to the podcast through our research and the things that we do in order to become better informed for these kind of podcasts, you can do that via Patreon at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you very much for listening or watching, as the case may be. Have yourselves a wonderful rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.